Ever catch yourself thinking, yeah, most people are biased, but I'm pretty objective? Well, get ready for a reality check because today's deep dive is all about cognitive biases. Those sneaky mental shortcuts that can, well, sometimes lead our thinking astray.
Right.
You gave us this fascinating research article from Perspectives on Psychological Science.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it really challenges the idea that any of us are truly unbiased.
It's true.
Yeah.
This article really digs into how deeply ingrained some of these biases can be, suggesting that a lot of them stem from just a handful of core beliefs we carry around.
Okay, so it's not just about like individual biases, it's about the underlying operating system of our brains.
Exactly. The authors call it belief-consistent information processing,
Right.
which basically means we're constantly filtering information through the lens of our existing beliefs.
So we're not just seeing what's actually there, we're seeing what we expect to see.
That's the gist of it. And it's not necessarily a conscious choice. These beliefs act like defaults, shaping how we interpret new information, how we interact with others, even how we view ourselves.
You know, speaking of those core beliefs, the article highlights a couple that really jumped out at me. The first one is this idea that my experience is a reasonable reference.
Yes. That underlying assumption that our personal experience is the norm, that other people pretty much see the world the same way we do.
Which, let's be honest, is kind of egocentric when you think about it. Like, why should my experience be the gold standard for everyone else?
And yet, it's a surprisingly common belief that underpins so many of the biases we hear about.
Yeah.
Take the false consensus effect, for instance.
Okay.
That's when we overestimate how much other people agree with us, even on things that are totally subjective.
It's like when you discover a band you love and you just assume everyone else must love them too, right?
Exactly.
And if they don't, well, there must be something wrong with their taste in music, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's that belief that my experience is normal, therefore everyone else must feel the same way.
Yeah.
And this same belief can also explain things like the spotlight effect.
Which is that feeling that everyone's always watching us, judging our every move. Like when you trip and spill your coffee everywhere and suddenly you're convinced everyone in the coffee shop is secretly judging your clumsiness.
Even though, in reality, they've probably forgotten about it 5 seconds later.
Right.
But in our heads, we're at the center of everyone's attention.
It's like our brains are wired for social paranoia.
Maybe not paranoia, but definitely a heightened awareness of our own social image. And again, it all ties back to that core belief. My experience is a reasonable reference. So if I'm hyper aware of my own clumsiness, others must be too, right?
Right. But it's not just about assuming everyone sees the world the same way we do. The article also talks about this belief that I make correct assessments.
Yes, that deep-seated conviction that our judgments are sound, our perceptions are accurate. Essentially, that we're rational beings who see the world clearly.
Which, again, might be giving ourselves a little too much credit.
Perhaps. But it's this belief that leads to things like the bias blind spot. We're so confident in our own objectivity that we're often blind to our own biases.
It's like that saying, we judge others by their actions and ourselves by our intentions.
Right.
So even when we do exhibit bias, we can explain it away as an honest mistake, while others' biases are seen as flaws in their character.
And this belief that we're inherently rational also plays into things like hostile media bias.
Which is when we consume news or information that challenges our views, and we automatically assume it's biased against us.
Because if I'm seeing things clearly, and this information contradicts my worldview, well, it must be distorted or biased information.
So it's not just about confirming our existing beliefs, it's about discrediting anything that challenges those beliefs.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is that these beliefs are often operating beneath the surface, unconsciously shaping our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So we've got these deeply ingrained beliefs shaping how we process information, often without us even realizing it. Kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? But the good news is, just becoming aware of these biases is a huge first step.
Absolutely. Awareness is key, because once we understand how these biases work, we can start to challenge them.
Which brings us to that intriguing strategy the article mentioned, the one about considering the opposite.
Yes. It sounds deceptively simple, but it can be surprisingly effective at shaking up those ingrained beliefs.
Okay, break it down for me. How does considering the opposite actually work in practice?
Well, it's not just about seeking out any opposing viewpoint. It's about actively engaging with perspectives that directly challenge our existing beliefs.
So if I'm someone who constantly falls victim to the spotlight effect, always assuming everyone's judging my every move.
Right, instead of just thinking, maybe people aren't judging me as much as I think. You'd actively seek out evidence that supports the opposite view.
Like what? Should I start asking strangers on the street if they're secretly judging my outfit?
Well, not necessarily. But you could try reflecting on times when you yourself were too caught up in your own thoughts to even notice what others were doing.
Oh.
Or think about how little attention you pay to strangers you pass on the street.
So I'm essentially trying to poke holes in my own bias by finding evidence that contradicts it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And you can do this with any bias. Let's say you're convinced your favorite political commentator is the only one who's truly objective.
Which, let's be honest, is a pretty common belief these days.
Absolutely. So instead of just consuming content that confirms your view, try actively seeking out analysis from commentators with different perspectives, even if you initially disagree with them.
Ooh, that's a tough one. Our instinct is often to avoid information that challenges our views.
It is uncomfortable, but that's where the growth happens.
Yeah.
By exposing ourselves to different perspectives, we force our brains to grapple with alternative explanations, with evidence that might contradict our cherished beliefs.
So it's like giving our brains a mental workout, building those critical thinking muscles.
Exactly. It's about training ourselves to be more discerning consumers of information, less likely to fall prey to confirmation bias.
Okay, this is making a lot of sense, but I have to admit, I'm still a little daunted by this whole consider the opposite thing. It sounds like it takes a lot of effort.
It does require effort, especially at first. But like any new skill, the more we practice it, the easier it becomes. Eventually, it can become a more automatic way of thinking.
So we're not just changing our minds, we're changing how our minds work.
Precisely. We're rewiring our brains to be more flexible, more open to nuance, less reliant on those automatic, often biased thought patterns.
This is all incredibly fascinating, but I want to go back to something we touched on earlier. The article mentioned how this belief plus belief consistent processing framework might explain more than just like the usual biases we hear about.
Right, it suggests this framework could apply to a whole range of mental quirks, from hindsight bias to even conspiracy thinking.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with hindsight bias, that I knew it all along feeling. How does that fit into this framework?
Well, think about it this way. When we look back on past events, our brains tend to focus on information that confirms our current understanding of the situation.
So we're basically rewriting history in our heads to fit our current beliefs.
In a sense, yes. We downplay information that contradicts our current view and emphasize information that supports it. And this happens unconsciously, so it feels like we genuinely knew it all along, even when we didn't.
And this is all because of that core belief that my experience is a reasonable reference.
Exactly. We're so sure of our current understanding that we assume our past selves must have seen things the same way.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about stereotypes? How do they fit into this whole belief plus belief consistent processing model?
Well, stereotypes are essentially just beliefs about groups of people. And like any other belief, they can lead to biased information processing.
So if I hold a stereotype that all people from a certain country are bad drivers.
Right. Then you're more likely to notice and remember instances where you see someone from that country driving poorly. And because of confirmation bias, you might even interpret ambiguous driving behavior as bad driving simply because it fits your existing stereotype.
And this happens even if the stereotype itself is based on faulty or incomplete information.
Exactly. Stereotypes can be incredibly resistant to change, even in the face of contradictory evidence.
Which brings us to conspiracy theories. This is where things get a little more complex, right?
Yes, it's a sensitive topic, but the article suggests that a conspiracy mentality could also stem from certain core beliefs, often related to distrust in authority or institutions.
So if someone believes that governments or powerful elites are constantly manipulating events behind the scenes,
Right, then they're more likely to interpret ambiguous events or information as evidence of a conspiracy, even if there's a simpler explanation.
it's like that old saying, if you're looking for a conspiracy, you'll find it everywhere.
Exactly, because our brains are wired to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs, even when those beliefs might be leading us down a rabbit hole.
This is all starting to make me wonder, are there ever situations where biases can actually be helpful?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore in our final segment, where we'll look at the potential benefits of biases, as well as some final thoughts on navigating this complex mental landscape.
So we spent most of this deep dive exploring, these downsides of biases, how they can distort our thinking and lead us to make well, bad judgments, frankly. But you hinted that there might be a flip side to this whole thing, that biases aren't always a bad thing. And I gotta admit, I'm having a little trouble wrapping my head around that.
It's true. We often focus on the negative consequences of biases, and for good reason, right? But it's important to remember that biases are essentially mental shortcuts, and sometimes those shortcuts can be helpful.
Okay, so how can a mental shortcut that leads to inaccurate judgments possibly be a good thing?
Well, think about it in terms of efficiency. Our brains are constantly bombarded with information, and we simply don't have the time or the mental resources to process everything deeply.
So that's where those mental shortcuts come in.
Exactly. Biases allow us to make quick judgments and decisions, even with limited information. And in some cases, those quick judgments can be crucial for our survival.
Okay, so give me an example. When could a bias actually be a lifesaver?
Let's say you're walking through a forest and you spot a long coiled shape on the ground. Now, your brain could take the time to rationally assess the situation, consider all the possibilities.
Or it could just scream, snake, danger, and send me running in the opposite direction.
Exactly. And in that situation, a bias toward assuming the worst, that the shape is a dangerous snake, could be the difference between a near miss and a nasty bite.
So in that case, it's better to be safe than sorry, even if it means, overreacting to a harmless stick.
Precisely. And this same principle can apply to social situations as well. Imagine you're meeting someone for the first time, and they remind you of a friend you really trust and admire.
So my brain might just automatically assume this new person is also trustworthy and likable, even though, I literally know nothing about them.
Exactly. It's a bias, sure, but it's also a powerful tool for social connection. It allows us to build rapport and trust quickly, which could be essential for forming relationships.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how biases can be a double-edged sword, helpful in some situations, potentially harmful in others.
Exactly. The key is to be aware of our own biases, to understand how they might be influencing our perceptions and our decisions. That way we can leverage their strengths while mitigating their weaknesses.
So it's not about eliminating biases altogether, it's about becoming more bias literate.
I like that term, bias literate. It's about recognizing that biases are a natural part of the human experience. We all have them. The goal is to develop a more nuanced understanding of how they operate so we can navigate the world with greater awareness and intention.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of how my own mind works.
That's what this deep dive is all about. And remember, this is just the beginning of the journey. The more we learn about biases, the more equipped we are to make thoughtful, informed decisions.
Well said. So, to our listeners out there, the next time you catch yourself making a snap judgment or clinging a little too tightly to a particular belief, take a moment to ask yourself, could a bias be at play here? It might just change your entire perspective.
And that's the first step towards becoming more bias literate, more in control of our own thinking.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep diving deep.